The title of this lecture is The 13 Colonies. When Europeans realized that the New World consisted of the two huge continents of South America and North America, and not the Indies, there was motivation to find new sources of riches. In addition, ordinary people began to see the New World as a home where they could escape the religious, political, and economic tyranny that existed in Europe. In 1607, the first permanent colony by the English was planted in Virginia at Chesapeake Bay by the London Company. With this emphasis on trade with little thought on agriculture, the Jamestown colony barely survived, only saved from extinction by the leadership of Captain John Smith. In 1619, two important events occurred. First, delegates from various communities met at a lower house, the House of Burgesses, to consider the enactment of laws for the colony. This was the first example of an elected legislature or a representative assembly in North America. Second, approximately 20 Blacks arrived in a Dutch ship, not as slaves, but as servants to be held a term of years and then freed. The Virginia governor, Sir George Yeardley, bought 15 of these so-called indentured servants for work on his tobacco plantation. Tragically, indentured servanthood of Blacks in the 1600s transitioned to full-blown slavery, in which Blacks could not become free men, as did some of the earlier Blacks. By the 1700s, large numbers of black slaves arrived in America. It took a deadly civil war many generations later to resolve the glaring contradiction of an elected assembly that encouraged democratic freedoms and the rise of slavery. Two things that were clearly contradicted each other. I'll return to the issue of slavery later. In 1624, Virginia became a royal colony, and in the next decade, the Chesapeake region was also the location for another colony. In 1632, King Charles I granted a charter for Maryland, named after his wife, Queen Mary. Unlike Virginia, which was first settled by a private corporation and later converted into a royal colony, Maryland was founded by a single aristocratic family, the Calverts. It was the first of several such proprietary colonies given by English monarchs to loyal followers. George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, was forced to resign from high office because of his conversion to Catholicism. Calvert still had some friends in high places, and he requested a grant in America to build a haven for Catholics. Although he died before obtaining the charter, his son, the second Lord Baltimore, took over the colonization endeavor. In 1634, 150 settlers arrived in Maryland. Maryland grew slowly after experiencing religious and political strife. The majority of the settlers were Protestants who resented the Catholic elite. As an appeasement, a Protestant governor was appointed, and freedom of worship was assured to all who believed in Jesus Christ. The Maryland Toleration Act was passed in 1649. It included a series of strict penalties for religious offenses. Unlike the London colony, the Plymouth colony, further to the north, was slow in its bid to begin colonization. Early explorations included one venture by Captain John Smith, resulted in the area being named New England. Eventually, the colonists who settled in the area were religious dissenters. These pilgrim separatists, from time to time, had been imprisoned and even executed for defying the government and the Church of England. One group escaped to Holland, seeking a place where they could worship in freedom. Because they were not Dutch citizens, however, they experienced prejudices, notably with jobs. They planned to settle elsewhere. Leaders of this group received permission from the Virginia Company to settle as an independent community with land of its own in Virginia. Note that the London and Plymouth companies were two divisions of the Virginia Company. This historic concession for pilgrims was the first of other settlement efforts by dissenting Protestants. The voyage was financed by English merchants. When they arrived in America, time and the elements forced them to land not in Virginia, but further north near Cape Cod, referred to Plymouth. Because this was outside the territory of their intended destinations, they would be without a government once on shore. Before embarking, an agreement was signed November 21st, 1620, the Mayflower Compact, named after their ship. The compact established a civil government under which the colonists would create congregations and profess loyalty to the crown. They landed the next month. They landed on December 21st, 1620, but the first winter was disastrous, with many dying from disease and malnutrition. Local natives, however, showed them how to obtain seafood and cultivate corn. After the first harvest, the Pilgrims invited the Indians to join them in an autumn festival, a harvest feast that was later called Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims could use the assistance. The Plymouth area had poor and rocky soil for agriculture, good enough for modest yields, but not enough to grow exportable staples. For exports, the Pilgrims turned to fishing and the fur trade. Though they had problems over finances, they never forgot their mission was a godly one. The Plymouth colony's government grew out of the Mayflower Compact, which was not a formal constitution, but an agreement among members of a religious group who believed that God had made a covenant with people to provide a way to salvation. Religion played almost as an important part in initiating the settlement of Massachusetts, as had been the case with the Pilgrims. The group called the Puritans intended the Massachusetts Bay Colony to be a holy commonwealth made up of religious folk together in the harmonious worship of God. Unlike the Pilgrim separatists, Puritans were hopeful that the Church of England could be reformed. The Puritan colony was to be considered a city upon a hill. Its origins began in 1629 when a group of Puritans and merchants were granted the Massachusetts Bay Company. The Puritan leader was John Winthrop, who took advantage of a fateful omission in the charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company. the usual proviso that the company maintain its home office in England. Sailing on 17 large ships, over 1,000 Puritans arrived in 1630, and although the first winter was severe, the colony prospered. The colony had several advantages over Plymouth and Jamestown. The leaders were wealthy. There was a focus on colonization. The initial group of settlers was large, and there was a sense of Yankee ingenuity to propel the colony. Boston became the chief city, reaching a population near 2,000 within 10 years. In Boston, a college was set up to train ministers. The college was named after the Reverend John Harvard. And a Harvard founder wrote, "After God had carried us safe to New England, and we had builded our houses, provided necessaries for our livelihood, reared convenient places for God's worship, and settled the civil government, one of the new things we longer for and looked after was to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity." Other colonies soon followed. Rhode Island colony began as a refuge for religious dissenters who agreed that the state had no right to coerce a particular religious belief. Roger Williams, a pastor, had been banished from Massachusetts for upholding radical views. In essence, he was seen as the purest of Puritans. Well, he established the town of Providence in 1636 and a government in 1644 as a result of a charter from Parliament. Williams had good relations with Native Americans and strived to learn their language. He agreed that colonists needed to negotiate an agreed price with Indians with any purchase of land. With a focus on liberty, Rhode Island welcomed Christians of all persuasions, but the colony grew slowly. Connecticut was founded in 1635 by a group of Massachusetts Puritans seeking better lands and access to the fur trade further west. In 1639, the leaders adopted a constitution known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. North of Connecticut, New Hampshire received settlers as early as the 1630s and became a separate colony in 1679. Before 1640, English settlers had established numerous settlements on the Atlantic coast, separated by the Dutch colony of New Netherlands that was in between. The restoration of Charles II, King Charles II, in 1660 initiated a new period of colonization. The king rewarded his faithful with truly regal gifts. The Carolinas, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania were founded by proprietors rather than companies. As a result of charters issued in 1663 and 1665, 8 proprietors gained Carolina. The Carolina colony developed in North and South regions. The northern part was the first to be settled, but experienced hardships due to swampland and a lack of natural harbors. The southern part was better suited as it offered fertile soil. Charleston had an excellent harbor and grew quickly. The Dutch were too weak to hold on to New Netherlands, and King Charles granted it to his brother, the Duke of York, in 1664. Religious leader George Fox and William Penn, who accepted the teachings of the Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers, purchased New Jersey in 1682. Penn also inherited Pennsylvania in 1681. Delaware was created as part of Pennsylvania, but in was treated as part of Pennsylvania, but in 1703 became a separate colony. The last colony to be founded in this period was Georgia. General James Oglethorpe obtained a charter in 1732, and the colony began the following year. So there you have your 13 colonies. Important economic points of early colonization and settlement are as follows. First, the American colonies were created for either economic or religious reasons. Two, the crown paid little attention to colonization, and thus the colonies began the process of Americanization that saw the development of distinct political and social structures. Economic life was primarily agricultural. Small farms were the norm. Few in numbers, the large plantations in the South were an exception. 4, American industry consisted of very small business operations. There were mostly peddlers, blacksmiths, and small shopkeepers. An inadequate monetary system and an undeveloped transportation system, these two things restricted inland commerce and economic activity. 5, Britain's merchant capitalism viewed the American colonies as producers of raw materials and consumers of British manufactured goods. British mercantilism had limited success, however, especially in the 1700s when the colonies increased their trade with other European nations and the West Indies. As the settlement of English colonies in North America grew and some economic success began to take hold, it became evident that the colonists were beginning to develop characteristics that were distinctly American, though marked by regional differences. Although still transplanted English subjects and still greatly influenced by European ideas and institutions, colonists were influenced by the new environment and the specific needs of the new land. And within America, one sees a continuation of the social and economic differences that define the northern and southern colonies. It is interesting that even birth and death rates differed for the North and South. The life expectancy in New England was remarkably high compared to the South. In the South, the life expectancy was around 40, whereas it was 70 in New England. In the Chesapeake region, indentured servants were prohibited from marrying until their term of servitude was completed, whereas in New England, there were more immigrants who arrived with family members. Family structure was more stable, and there was a more balanced sex ratio of males and females in New England. It would be wrong to characterize either the northern or southern colonies in the 17th centuries as democracies or republics. Still, there were signs of a democratizing influence. On the issue of voting, it was not difficult for many white males to meet the property requirements since land was so easily acquired. The availability of land nurtured an American democratic tradition. Most early settlers were ordinary folk. The elite were small in numbers. In the Chesapeake region, as many as 3/4 of the immigrants were indentured servants. Indentured servanthood was supposedly voluntary. The name was derived from the indenture or contract by which a person would agree to labor in return for the ship's fare to America. This contract was common because many of those who wanted to go to America were poor peasants and laborers. Life was hard for indentured servants, but a number were able to experience modest success as farmers and artisans. By the late 17th century, the number of indentured servants arriving in America declined, mainly as a result of the more favorable economic conditions in England. Landowners, particularly in the Southern colonies, saw African slavery as the answer to their labor needs. In general, slavery refers to, quote, a condition in which individuals are owned by others who control where they live and what they work, with how much subsistence they are provided, and where exploitation is permissible, including sexual exploitation. Slaves performed many functions, and slavery was a form of control and organization. Unfortunately, slavery has played a consistent role in the human experience for thousands of years, and African societies suffered disproportionately. Since private property was not recognized in Africa, the ownership of slaves as compared to land stood as a measure of personal wealth in Africa. In Africa, slaves were frequently the result of military capture, but many came from kidnapping, failure to pay debt, or by the voluntary action of family members. For centuries before the arrival of the Europeans, millions of Africans passed into the Islamic world as part of the trans-Saharan slave trade. The Europeans tied into the existing slave networks. Firearms were the most popular item that the Europeans exchanged for slaves. It has been estimated that 12 million Africans arrived in the Western Hemisphere, with another 4 million dying during the Ocean Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is an event of legendary inhumanity. Africans were herded up and packed tightly together in slave ships and subjected to a 4 to 6 week Atlantic passage. It was not unusual for women to be raped or sexually abused. Chained and only having minimal food and water, the slaves became weak and inflicted with sickness. Gradually, with rationalizations based on color difference, the practice of perpetual Black slavery became the custom and law of the land. The slaves were thrown indiscriminately together and treated like work animals. There were cases of organized rebellions, but they were few and ineffective. With the odds so heavily stacked against resistance, most slaves resigned themselves to the overwhelming authority of the, quote, peculiar institution, a euphemism of something really quite horrible. By 1750, 20% of the American population was Black. Of the 250,000 Blacks in the colonies, only about 16,000 were located in New England. The main reason why slavery took hold in the South was largely because of these large-scale landholding operations that required many laborers. The labor from family members alone was inadequate for these large plantations, particularly these larger cotton plantations. The cultivation of new land was imperative for crops, including tobacco crops, cotton crops, and rice farming. All of this required much labor. The rise of the 13 colonies point to the diversity of the people. Certainly, New Englanders were distinct from the Virginians and the Carolinians, but both northern and southern colonies experienced the influence of evangelicalism. Beginning in the late 1600s, intellectuals took the science that explained the natural world and applied it to political and social problems. Enlightenment thinkers sought to use science to better understand the human condition. But Enlightenment ideas, notably the idea of a distant deistic God, challenged much of Christian theology. Enlightenment thinkers saw God as a great clockmaker who built an orderly universe and then stepped aside and let it run. Evangelicals such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield opposed such thinking that elevated man and minimized God. Maintaining the importance of the new birth conversion experience and the authority of God's Holy Scripture, evangelicals generated revivalism in the northern and southern colonies. Evangelical revivalism became a dominant theme that shaped early colonial church culture and society. The focus of evangelicalism and revivalism was on personal salvation. Evangelicals favored a direct, personal, and popular approach to reach listeners. As a teenager, Jonathan Edwards had a good knowledge of Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. He graduated from Yale College at age 17 with the highest honors of his class. He played a major role in supporting the powerful revivals of the 1730s and 1740s, which was later called the Great Awakening. Edwards wrote about the conversions and the revival that were occurring in New England in the 1630s. His writings of revival activity were published in London, and his work was a catalyst for other more dramatic evangelists to spread the gospel throughout America. A cross-eyed Englishman named George Whitefield became the traveling preacher extraordinaire of the Great Awakening. Whitefield, who was Oxford educated, visited America in 1738. He crossed the Atlantic 13 times, and more than a third of his life mission was devoted to converting souls in the American colonies. At a revival meeting in Philadelphia, he preached to over 30,000 people, much to the amazement of Benjamin Franklin, who was in attendance. Okay, to conclude, to better understand today's America, to better understand the United States, one must appreciate the forces at play in the colonial era when 13 colonies took root. The extensive land and potential wealth of North America, not yet fully realized, promised a large and thriving commerce in the future. Tragically, plantation life in the South resulted in the development of slave labor. A more positive development was the growth of America as the common masses sought refuge from the religious, political, and economic tyranny of Europe. Notwithstanding the evil of slavery, there was a nurturing of democratic ideas. Notably, religiosity was vibrant in colonial America. Even as Enlightenment figures relegated God to a lesser stage in European society, Bible-believing Christians in America rejected such a path. These people, aware of their imperfections, desired and sought God's direction.